The plains burned quietly beneath a copper sun, wide, endless, and empty as a man's heart after too many goodbyes. The wind had a dry voice, rasping across the dead grass, whispering to no one but the bones of forgotten cattle and the ghosts of riders who never made it home. Dust hung in the air like an old prayer that had lost its words. Far beyond the reach of towns or mercy, the land stretched open like a wound. It wasn't cruel, just honest. Out here, the earth didn't lie. It told you what you were worth, and for most, that wasn't much. A hawk circled overhead, lonely as the sound of boots on gravel. Below, a single house, if you could call it that, leaned against the horizon. Wood gray as ash, roof half gone, door held shut by stubbornness more than hinges. A well stood near it, dry for 3 summers now, its rope stiff with dust. Inside, silence. The kind that isn't empty but full of everything unsaid, undone, unburied. A man sat by the window, hat tipped low, face cut from shadow and sun. His name was Luke Marrow, though nobody called him that anymore. Names had weight, and his had been buried long ago with a wife and a flag. He watched the horizon the way a sinner watches the altar, hoping for a sign, dreading one too. The world had gone on without him, but the land still waited, patient as grief. When the wind came, it carried no scent of rain, no promise of spring, only the faint tang of iron, like blood remembered. It swept through the open cracks of his cabin, stirring the ashes in the stove, brushing the edge of an old photograph pinned to the wall, a woman smiling in a time that no longer existed. Outside, thunder rumbled somewhere too far to mean anything. The sky darkened at the edges, slow and heavy. A storm was coming, but not the kind that breaks the drought. The kind that brings strangers to your door and makes you remember the man you used to be. Luke rose, slow as the sun setting behind the hills, his boots echoing in the hollow space that used to be called home. He didn't know what he was waiting for, only that the land had gone quiet, as if holding its breath. Then, from somewhere beyond the ridge, came a faint sound, something soft, uncertain, human. The cry of the wind? Or something the wind carried? He stepped out onto the porch. The first drops of rain began to fall, darkening the dust at his feet. Lightning split the sky, and for one heartbeat, the horizon came alive, and he thought he saw a figure stumbling through the storm. Someone was coming. And nothing in this land stayed the same once the rain began. The rain came slow, like a warning whispered through the bones of the earth. It wasn't enough to heal the land, just enough to sting the dust into mud. Luke Marrow pulled his coat tight and squinted through the haze, the lightning flashing white across his weathered face. There, between the mesquite and the dead fence line, a shape moved. Small. Unsteady. Human. He didn't call out. Words wouldn't carry in this kind of storm, and even if they did, words had never saved anyone out here. He just moved, the way a man moves when something inside him stirs after too long being still. The figure collapsed before he reached her. By the time he knelt beside her, the wind had already tried to bury her tracks. She was half covered in mud, hair tangled with rain and blood. Her hands were torn, palms raw like she'd been running, or digging. Her dress was the color of dusk, torn to ribbons by the desert brush. Luke hesitated. There were stories about women found on the plains, ghosts, bait, or worse. But this one was breathing, shallow and stubborn, like the land itself. He lifted her head gently, rain sliding down his calloused fingers. Her lips were cracked, whispering something he couldn't hear, or maybe didn't want to. He reached for the canteen slung over his shoulder, tipped it to her mouth. Water spilled across her chin, but she swallowed a little. Enough to live, maybe. He gathered her up, light as memory, cold as regret, and carried her toward the cabin. The storm closed behind them, erasing every footprint they left. Inside, the room seemed smaller with her in it. He laid her on the old cot near the stove, the one he hadn't used since the war. Her pulse fluttered weak under his thumb. He peeled away the wet cloth from her shoulder, saw the dark bruise of a bullet graze, half-healed and angry. No words came. None were needed. He cleaned the wound, slow and steady, like he'd done for brothers long gone. When she stirred, her eyes opened, not wide, just enough to see him. And in that brief, blurred glance, he saw the kind of fear that had forgotten how to scream. He draped his coat over her, fed the fire 2 logs, and sat beside her without looking away. Outside, thunder rolled over the plains, softening into silence. For the first time in years, Luke Marrow didn't feel alone. He didn't know who she was or where she'd come from. But he knew this: the storm had brought her here for a reason, and the land never gave second chances without taking something in return. Morning broke slow and colorless, light crawling across the floorboards like something too shy to stay. The storm had passed, but its voice lingered in the damp wood and the smell of wet earth. She woke before him. The coat he draped over her shoulders had slipped to the floor, heavy with the scent of smoke and saddle leather. Her eyes darted to the door, open, unbarred, and to the man asleep in the chair beside her, head bowed, hat over his face. His rifle leaned in the corner, close enough to reach, but untouched. She didn't run. Instead, she reached for the tin cup beside the stove, half full of water, and sipped, each drop trembling against the rim like courage learning to stand. By noon, he was splitting wood out back. The sound echoed sharp through the dry air, axe, breath, axe, steady, methodical. She watched from the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, her hair a wild halo of morning light. When he noticed, he didn't speak. Just nodded once, slow, as if to say, "You're still here." That evening, he set a bowl of beans on the table. 2 spoons. No invitation, no demand, just space left open, like an unfinished prayer. She hesitated, then sat across from him. The first bite was silent, the second wasn't. The spoon clinked against the tin, and somehow that small sound filled the whole room. Later, she tried to help. When he reached for the lamp, she struck the match instead. The flame flickered between them, thin, golden, fragile, painting their faces in half-light. He watched her hands, careful, deliberate, trembling only when she thought he wasn't looking. Over the next few days, the rhythm took root. He mended her torn dress by lamplight, stitching slow, rough, but true. She swept the dust from the floor, each stroke of the broom soft as forgiveness. He built a chair, not because they needed one, but because his hands needed something to believe in. Sometimes they spoke in fragments. A name. A question. A thank you whispered too quietly to be sure it was real. But most of what passed between them wasn't words, it was the way she handed him the hammer before he asked, or the way he turned the blanket toward her when the night wind rose. By the 4th morning, the silence had changed its shape. It no longer hung heavy, it hummed. Something gentle lived in it now, something that belonged to neither of them alone. And when the fire cracked in the stove that night, he looked up from the chair he'd built, and she was already looking back, as if they both understood that sometimes, the quiet is where trust begins to speak. The days blurred into a rhythm, quiet, steady, almost kind. But healing has a way of stirring up ghosts. Sometimes, when the wind came down from the ridge and rattled the shutters, Luke saw her eyes go distant, as if she were listening for something only she could hear. It was on one of those wind-heavy afternoons that he found the locket. It had fallen from her blanket when she stood to fetch water, a small silver oval, worn smooth by years and weather. When he stooped to hand it back, her hand shot out faster than fear itself. The look in her eyes stopped him cold, not anger, not shame, just the ache of being seen too soon. He didn't ask whose face it held. He just placed it gently on the table beside her cup and went back to mending the fence. That night, after the lamp burned low, she opened it. Inside was nothing, just the faded outline where a picture once lived. She ran her thumb over the emptiness, her lips moving without sound. He saw from the corner of his eye, though he pretended not to. The way she tucked it close to her chest before blowing out the light. A few days later, as they fixed the roof together, a splinter caught her sleeve. The fabric tore back just enough for him to see it, a scar running down her shoulder, pale against her skin, shaped like lightning. He froze. She noticed his eyes, then looked away. For a moment, neither moved. Then she said softly, "They marked me when I tried to run." Her voice was calm, almost hollow. She didn't explain who they were. She didn't need to. Luke nodded once, hammered the next nail, and said, "They took my name when I wouldn't fight their war anymore." It was the first time he'd spoken of the past since she'd arrived. The sound of it seemed to settle something between them, two broken truths hanging in the same air, no longer lonely. That night, the rain returned, tapping against the roof like fingers remembering a tune. She sat by the fire, the locket open on her knee, and he cleaned the mud from his boots. Neither spoke, but the silence wasn't empty now. It carried the weight of two lives scarred in different ways, both still here, both still breathing. When she finally looked up, her eyes found his, and she said, "You kept building, even after they took everything." He didn't answer, just gave a small, tired smile and placed one last log on the fire. The flame caught slow, then bright. And for a brief, fragile moment, the light filled the room where the past had once lived. The horizon broke quiet that morning, too quiet. No wind. No birds. Just the kind of stillness that means something's listening. Luke felt it before he saw them. Two riders, dark against the gold of the rising sun, coming slow but sure, leaving straight tracks across the open land. He watched from the porch, thumb resting on the edge of his belt buckle instead of the rifle. He already knew what they were. Men who wore dust like armor. Men who came to collect what others lost. Inside, she froze when she heard the hooves. Her hand went to the locket, fingers trembling over the empty space inside. "They found me," she whispered, voice barely more than breath. Luke didn't ask who they were. He just said, "Stay inside," and stepped off the porch. The riders drew up, rain-dried coats flapping like wings of crows. One was young and mean-eyed, the other looked old enough to remember when mercy still meant something. "We're looking for a woman," the older one said. "Ran from a house east of here. Said she killed a man." Luke's jaw tightened, the muscle twitching just once. He let his eyes drift toward the distant hills, pretending to think. "No woman come through here," he said evenly. "Storm washed out most tracks 2 nights back. You'll lose daylight if you ride north." The younger man spat. "You sure about that, old-timer? Folks say you keep to yourself out here. Easy place to hide someone." Luke didn't move, didn't blink. But the silence stretched until it felt like the sky itself was waiting for his next breath. Inside the cabin, she stood by the window, watching the back of him, the man who owed her nothing and yet was lying for her life. She could see his hand twitch near the gun, not from fear but from something older, instinct, maybe. Duty. Finally, the older rider tipped his hat. "Let's move," he said. "Ain't nothin' here but ghosts." They turned their horses and rode off, slow at first, then fading into the glare of morning. When Luke came back inside, she was still by the window. "You should have told them," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't angry, just broken in a different way. He hung his hat, poured a little water into the basin, and said, "I already buried enough people for tellin' the truth." For a long time, she stared at him, at the man who had just traded his safety for hers. The fire popped in the stove, and outside, the wind found its voice again. Something fragile had been tested in that silence. And though neither said it, they both knew, the storm wasn't over. It had just changed its shape. The days that followed were quieter, but it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was something softer, like the land exhaling after a long drought. She moved about the cabin with a kind of calm now. Still cautious, still watchful, but no longer waiting to run. Her hands found small ways to belong, folding his shirts, patching the torn curtain, sweeping the porch where his boots had left their story in dust. Luke spoke little, but when he did, his voice had changed, gentler at the edges, as if every word had to pass through something warm first. He fixed the gate she always bumped into, carved a small bird from a scrap of cedar, and left it by her bowl one morning without a word. She found it before sunrise. The wings were uneven, the carving rough, but its shape held flight. She turned it in her hands for a long time, thumb tracing the lines like reading a prayer. When she stepped outside, the horizon was pink with first light, and Luke was already there, feeding the mare. She walked to him slowly, the cedar bird in her palm. When he saw it, he started to speak, but she shook her head. Instead, she reached out and placed it back in his hand. "For you," she said softly. He frowned a little, confused. "You carved it," he murmured. "You gave it wings," she said. The words hung between them, simple and final. Then her fingers brushed his, light, uncertain, and didn't pull away. For the first time, he didn't look past her. He looked at her. Something unspoken moved between them, carried on the morning wind, something too fragile for speech. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the small scar above her lip, the one the rain hadn't washed away. He lifted his hand, paused, then touched her cheek with the gentleness of a man who remembers what it costs to hurt. Her eyes closed. His thumb caught a tear he hadn't meant to find. No promises. No confessions. Just the quiet truth of two people who had finally stopped running, from others, from themselves. When the wind rose again, it didn't sound lonely anymore. It sounded alive, threading through the dry grass, stirring the dust into small circles of light. He left the cedar bird on the windowsill that night. And when the moon climbed high over the plains, its pale glow touched the carved wings, casting a shadow that looked almost like flight. The land woke slow beneath a sky rinsed clean of sorrow. Dew clung to the grass like forgiveness, and the sun rose steady over the ridge, spilling gold across the porch where two mugs waited, side by side, still warm. Luke sat in the doorway, sharpening a knife that no longer needed to be sharp. She knelt in the garden she'd made from dust, coaxing green from the same earth that once refused it. Neither spoke, they didn't need to. The silence had changed its meaning. Out beyond the fence line, the wind moved gentle, turning the dry fields into rivers of light. The same wind that once carried loneliness now carried the sound of her laughter, low, soft, alive. He looked toward her, the morning sun catching in her hair, and for the first time in years, the ache in his chest didn't feel like loss. It felt like home finding its way back. A hawk circled high above them, gliding easy on the breeze. He watched it fade into the blue, then whispered, not to her, not to anyone, she's free now. The world didn't answer, but the land did. The dust lifted, the air shimmered, and somewhere in the quiet heart of the plains, a single truth settled like light upon the earth. The wind still carried dust, but now, it carried their peace.